He had thrown his breakfast at the wall by 7 in the morning. By 9, he had made 2 nurses cry and told the attending physician that his medical degree was worth less than the dirt on a Helmand Province road. By 11, every single staff member on Ward 7C had found a reason to be somewhere else. Commander Richard Sterling had been at the Carl Vinson Veterans Affairs Medical Center for 4 days, and in those 4 days he had managed to become the most feared patient in the building's 30-year history. That was until Catherine Bennett picked up his chart. What happened next would be talked about on that ward for years. Not because of the medicine, because of what was written on the inside of a woman's left arm, and what it meant to a man who thought he was the only one still carrying Sangin. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee had been the first thing Catherine Bennett noticed on her first morning at Carl Vinson, 11 years ago. Now, at 34, it was simply the smell of work. She moved through it the way she moved through everything, steadily, without drama, with the particular economy of motion that belonged to people who had learned to do essential things quickly in conditions where slowness had consequences. Ward 7C was a long corridor of 12 rooms, a nurse's station that smelled faintly of burned microwave popcorn at all hours, and a supply closet that Kat had personally reorganized 3 times, because nobody else seemed to understand that the order of things in a supply closet was not an aesthetic preference, but a functional one. The ward housed veterans with complex medical conditions, the kind that accumulated over careers spent in places that the body was not designed to survive and that the mind never quite finished processing. Kat had chosen this work on purpose, not the nursing, which she had chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with purpose and everything to do with needing somewhere to put what she knew how to do. The VA specifically, because the VA was where the people she recognized ended up, and she understood them in a way that had nothing to do with clinical training and everything to do with having been in the same dirt. She did not advertise this. She wore her scrubs, she kept her left arm covered to the elbow in most circumstances, and she did her job with the unshakable, slightly terrifying calm that had made her the person the charge nurses called when a situation was beyond managing and someone needed to simply walk into the room and resolve it. Room 714 had been beyond managing since Monday. She found out about it in the way she found out about most things on the ward. Not from a formal briefing, but from the specific quality of silence that gathered around a problem the staff had collectively decided was not going to be solved by normal means. Nurse Brenda Kowalski was at the station when Kat arrived on Tuesday morning, dabbing at an oatmeal stain on her scrub top with a paper towel and the expression of someone who had recently been through something she was not yet ready to describe. "He threw it," Brenda said, without preamble. Kat looked at the stain. The breakfast tray? The whole thing? Brenda's voice had a tremor in it that Kat recognized as the specific tremor of someone who had been yelled at by a person who knew exactly how to yell. "He said my incompetence was more lethal than enemy fire. He said—" She stopped. She looked at the paper towel in her hand. "He said a lot of things." Dr. Thomas Harrison appeared from the medication room doorway, looking like a man who had been hoping the hallway would be empty and was disappointed to find it wasn't. He was holding Richard Sterling's chart with the particular grip of someone who would prefer to be holding something else. "He needs his vancomycin," Harrison said. He said it to Kat because Kat was the person you said things to when you needed them to actually happen. If he misses another dose, the osteomyelitis is going to win. We're looking at sepsis by tonight. "Then find someone else," Brenda said, her voice cracking. He demanded someone with a spine. His exact words. Someone with a spine and actual military experience, because apparently none of us qualify. Kat had already taken the chart from Harrison's hands. She was reading it the way she read everything. Not sequentially, but diagnostically, going straight to the information that told her what she actually needed to know. She moved past the blood work, past the imaging reports, past the nursing notes that documented 4 days of escalating hostility. She found the demographic section. She found the military service record. Commanding officer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Sangin Province, Afghanistan. 2010. She read those 4 lines twice. Then she closed the chart with a sound that was more final than it needed to be for a metal binder. "Draw up the vancomycin," she said, "and a fresh saline flush." She looked at Harrison. I'll take him. Harrison's relief was palpable and slightly embarrassing. Kat, I want to be clear about what you're walking into. He's in significant pain, he's febrile, and he's been using this ward as a target for everything he's carrying. Be careful. I've dealt with worse, she said. It was not a boast. It was a fact delivered in the specific register of a fact. She prepared the medication tray with the methodical precision she brought to all clinical preparation. Everything in order. Everything accounted for. The vancomycin drawn up, the flush prepared, the necessary equipment laid out in the sequence she would use it. She had done this 10,000 times. She had done versions of it in conditions that made a VA hospital room look like a spa. The preparation was the same regardless. She walked down the corridor toward room 714. The other staff found reasons to look elsewhere as she passed. She did not take this personally. She understood it the way she understood most things about institutional behavior, as information about the situation rather than commentary on the people. She stopped outside the room. Through the narrow glass window, she could see Richard Sterling. He was sitting upright in the hospital bed with the rigid posture of someone who had trained himself out of the ability to truly rest. His silver hair was trimmed in a precise military fade. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the television, which was off, which meant he was not watching it, but using it as a surface to project whatever was occupying the inside of his head. His left forearm was heavily bandaged. The remnants of the breakfast tray were scattered across the linoleum in a pattern that suggested force rather than accident. She pushed the door open. She did not knock. I told that Weeping Willow to send someone who actually knows how to follow a direct order. Richard's voice was gravel and rusted iron, and it filled the room the way voices did when they had spent decades being used to be heard over the sound of combat operations. He had not turned his head. Unless you have a medical degree and a functioning brain, turn around. Good morning, Commander Sterling, Kat said. She stepped over the spilled oatmeal with the unceremonious efficiency of someone navigating an obstacle rather than commenting on it. She set the medication tray on the bedside table. My name is Catherine. I'll be taking over your care. And for the record, the floor is for walking on, not for your breakfast. Richard turned his head. He looked at her with the assessing efficiency of someone who had spent decades reading people for threat and capability simultaneously. He saw a woman of average height, dark hair pulled back in a utilitarian bun with no decorative intention whatsoever. No jewelry, no makeup, navy blue scrubs that were absolutely pristine despite the fact that she had clearly been working for several hours already. She was looking back at him with an expression that was not quite neutral. Neutral implied the absence of assessment. This was something more active. She was looking at him the way a person looked at a clinical situation they had already begun to solve. I don't need a babysitter, he said. His voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted people to understand the conversation was over. I need competent medical staff. I need to speak to the chief of medicine. I am not letting another civilian stick needles in my veins because she watched a tutorial. You have a raging bone infection, Commander. Kat snapped on her nitrile gloves with the efficiency of someone who had put on gloves in the dark in moving vehicles in conditions that made nitrile gloves a luxury rather than a standard. If you don't receive this vancomycin in the next 10 minutes, you will very likely go into septic shock. The chief of medicine is currently in surgery. You're stuck with me. Give me your right arm. The fury that moved across Richard Sterling's face was the specific fury of a man who was not accustomed to being given instructions and had made a career out of being the one who gave them. Do you have any idea who you are talking to? I'm talking to the patient in room 714, Kat said. She picked up the tourniquet. Who needs in 4-line in the next 10 minutes? Get out. The voice dropped further into the calm register that was more threatening than the loud one. Get someone else. Get a male nurse. Get a military doctor. I'm not letting some soft suburban civilian touch me. You know nothing about pain. You know nothing about sacrifice. Get out of my room. Kat stood very still. She looked at the man in front of her, the frame that had once been granite, now diminished by infection and age and the accumulated weight of whatever he was carrying, which was clearly considerable. She had spent 11 years on this ward, and she knew the difference between patients who were difficult because they were frightened and patients who were difficult because they were grieving. Richard Sterling was grieving. She could see it in the specific quality of his anger, which was not directed at her. It was directed at everything that had rendered him horizontal, everything that had taken the control he had spent his entire adult life maintaining and put it in the hands of civilians he did not trust and could not assess. She placed the tourniquet back on the tray. "I'll give you exactly 1 hour," she said. "I will be back at 1,400 hours. You will take this medication. This is not a request." She turned and walked out. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for a moment. Not to recover. She didn't need to recover. To think. Because room 714 and the man in it had activated something in her that she kept in a specific, very carefully maintained compartment, and the compartment needed a moment of management before she could continue. She pushed off the wall and walked back to the nurse's station. She spent the intervening hour doing the rest of her work. Room 712 had a post-operative veteran with a wound that needed redressing. Room 708 had a patient whose blood pressure had been trending in a direction she wanted to address before Harrison's rounds. Room 703 had a 91-year-old man who had been in Korea and who had, in 4 years of intermittent stays on the ward, never once asked Kat what she did before nursing. She had always appreciated that about him. He simply accepted her presence as a fact, the way old soldiers accepted most things as conditions that existed and required response rather than commentary. She documented everything. She consulted with Harrison on the blood pressure situation. She checked in with the pharmacy about a medication timing issue that had been generating confusion on the board. She did all of it with the same precise attention. She gave everything. And she did not think about room 714 until it was time to think about room 714. At 1,400 hours, she prepared a fresh tray. She walked back down the corridor. The situation had changed. She could see it before she reached the door. The quality of sound from room 714 was different. Not the aggressive silence of a man holding his fire, but the labored quiet of a man losing ground to a fever that had been advancing while he spent his energy being difficult. She pushed the door open. Richard was against the pillows now, not sitting upright. His skin had taken on a sheen that wasn't perspiration, but the specific quality of a fever doing serious work. His breathing was shallow and more rapid than it had been 3 hours ago. The pale blue eyes, when they opened and found her, still had fire in them, but the fire was burning through compromised fuel. "I told you to get someone else," he said. His voice had lost register. It came out rough and lower than before. "The order was ignored," Kat said. She wheeled the 4-stand to the bedside. She looked at the heart rate monitor without appearing to look at it, reading the numbers in the peripheral attention she had trained to operate independently of her direct focus. The rhythm was erratic in the specific way of someone whose heart was working harder than it should to compensate for a systemic infection. "Your temperature is 103.4 degrees. You're running out of time. I need to start a central line. Nobody is putting a line in my chest." He tried to sit up. The effort produced a visible cost. A muscle in his jaw jumped, and his hand went immediately to his bandaged leg, which had apparently communicated its displeasure with the movement very clearly. "You civilian pill pushers are all the same. You think because you went to school and you work in a building with air conditioning, you understand life and death. You understand nothing." Kat was preparing the sterile field. She opened the chlorhexidine swabs with the economical motion of someone who had set up sterile fields on tables, on floors, on the hoods of vehicles, in the back of helicopters. She was listening to him, but she was not being derailed by him. "Lie back down," she said. "You are straining your heart. Don't call me Richard." The fist hit the mattress, not with the force of a well man, which made it somehow more significant rather than less. "You call me Commander. None of you have earned anything else. You sit here in your controlled environment, complaining about your shifts, while better men than any of you bled into the dirt and asked for nothing." His eyes had gone somewhere else, the way eyes went when a fever was burning a hole in the membrane between the present and a past that had never been adequately processed. "You think a needle hurts? Try watching a 19-year-old kid holding his intestines in his hands. Try writing the letter to his mother. Try living with the knowledge that you sent him down the alley." Kat had stopped moving. She was holding a betadine swab, and she had not lowered it to the tray, and she had not placed it on the skin. She was standing very still. "Private First Class Daniel Miller," Richard said. His voice had broken its military register. What came through the break was not weakness, but something worse and more honest. Grief that had been kept in a military container for 12 years and was now escaping through the compromised seal of a high fever and 4 days of physical diminishment. "Corporal Jason Wyatt. I ordered them down that alley. I cleared the route. I reviewed the drone footage myself. I gave a command. Move to phase line yellow." He closed his eyes. 10 seconds later, the earth opened up. The room was very quiet. Kat set the betadine swab down on the tray. She walked to the door and locked it. She walked to the window and pulled the privacy blinds closed. The room went dim. Richard blinked. His combat instincts flickered through the fever. She watched him register the change in light, register the click of the lock, process the information, and not know what to do with it because it didn't fit any category he had prepared for. "What are you doing?" he said. Kat walked back to the foot of his bed. She unclipped her hospital ID badge and set it on the bedside table. Then she reached up to the cuff of her left scrub sleeve and pushed the dark blue fabric up past her elbow. She did not speak yet. She let him see. "You talk about the dirt," she said. Her voice had changed, not in volume. If anything, it was quieter than it had been. But the clinical detachment was gone. What replaced it was something that had more density, the way water has more density than air without being louder about it. "You talk about the sand, about the 19-year-old kids, about what it means to hold the line." She stepped into the light from the overhead exam lamp. She rotated her left arm so the inner forearm faced him. The tattoo was not small. It was not a decoration. It was the kind of ink that goes on skin because it needs to go somewhere permanent, because the person putting it there needs to make something that was a time and a place and is something they can carry forward and touch. At its center, the caduceus, the winged staff and serpents of the medical corps. But the caduceus was not alone. Intertwined with it, inseparable from it, was the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. Above the combined emblem, in Gothic lettering that had been put there with conviction rather than aesthetics, Fleet Marine Force. And below it, the numbers and the name that made Richard Sterling stop breathing. 3/5. Dark Horse. "I was there," Kat said. "Sangin Province. 8 months. I was a Navy hospital corpsman attached to your infantry unit. I breathed the same sand. I ate the same food. I treated the same men." She held his gaze. "I know what Route 611 looked like because I walked it. I know what the IED blast radius of a pressure plate looks like at 40 feet because I measured one. I know what it meant to be 3 of 5 Dark Horse because I was 3 of 5 Dark Horse." Richard Sterling had not moved. His jaw was working, but producing nothing. The feverish glaze in his pale blue eyes had cracked. Not broken, cracked, in the specific way of something very hard that meets something it did not expect and does not know what to do with. "You want to talk about Private First Class Daniel Miller?" Kat's voice changed quality again, steadier, but at a cost that was becoming visible. A single tear had made it past her defenses and was tracking down the side of her face. She did not acknowledge it. "Danny was my patient. When the IED went off, I was the one who came through the suppressive fire to get to him. I tied his tourniquets. My hands were in his chest cavity for 11 minutes, trying to hold what the blast had separated." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the weight of something that needed to be said directly. "I was the last face Danny Miller saw, Commander. I held his hand until he was gone. So do not tell me I don't know what it means to serve. Do not tell me I don't know what it means to bleed." The silence in room 714 was complete. The cardiac monitor beeped its urgent rhythm. The afternoon light pressed at the edges of the closed blinds. Somewhere down the corridor, ordinary ward sounds continued their ordinary business, entirely unaware of what was happening in this room. Richard Sterling raised his right hand. It was trembling, visibly, the tremor of a man whose physical resources have been depleted by infection and grief in roughly equal measure. His fingers reached toward the tattoo on her arm, toward the eagle and the anchor and the numbers, and stopped just short of touching it, as though the ink were something that required a level of reverence that actual contact would diminish. Doc, he said. The word came out in a register she recognized. It was a register of men who had used it as a title and a form of address and a lifeline simultaneously, the specific compressed weight of a single syllable that carried years of meaning. You're a doc. I was, she said. She gently rolled her sleeve back down. Now I'm your nurse, and you're going to let me place this central line or you're going to die from a bone infection in a VA hospital bed. And I'm not going to lose another man from the March 5th. She looked at him. Do we understand each other? Richard Sterling, the man who had thrown his breakfast at the wall, who had reduced 2 nurses to tears, who had told the attending physician that his medical degree was worth less than enemy fire, who had spent 12 years carrying the ghost of a province he could not forget, lay his head back against the pillow. He closed his eyes. A single tear escaped and tracked into the lines of his weathered face. Aye, Doc, he said. Do it. She placed the central line in 18 minutes. It was a clean procedure, executed with the efficiency of someone for whom the technical components had been compressed by repetition into something close to reflex. She prepped the site below his right collarbone with chlorhexidine, warned him before the needle, and felt him hold completely still in the way that men who had been trained to hold still under worse conditions held still. No flinching, no complaint. The guide wire threaded perfectly. The catheter seated without complication. She sutured it in place and connected the vancomycin. Procedure complete, she said. She stepped back and removed her gloves. She disposed of the sharps. She wiped the sweat from her own forehead with the back of her wrist in a gesture that was automatic rather than deliberate. Thank you, Doc, Richard said. His voice was the voice of a man who had put down something very heavy and was figuring out what his hands did now that they were empty. Cat pulled the rolling stool to his bedside and sat down. The adrenaline of the confrontation was receding, and what it left behind was the particular exhaustion of emotional work done in clinical conditions, the kind of tired that sleep would eventually address, but not tonight. You were a terror to my staff today, she said. I know, he said. He was looking at the ceiling the way people looked at ceilings when they were trying to find words that didn't exist in standard configurations. I thought I was back in Helmand. The antiseptic, the machines, the pain in my leg where the shrapnel took the bone. It all compressed together, and I stopped being here. He paused. I should not have said what I said to your nurses. No, Kat agreed. You shouldn't have. The young one, Brenda. I'll pass it on, Kat said. She meant it. In her experience, the apology that came through a third party after the fact was not meaningless. It was often the only form available to people who didn't know how to deliver one directly. Richard was quiet for a moment. The vancomycin was moving through the line, doing the work it had been prevented from doing for 3 days. His color was already slightly better, or she was projecting, which was also possible. She was not immune to hoping. 12 years, he said, not to her specifically, to the ceiling, to the room, to the specific audience of ghosts that Kat recognized he had been carrying since Sangin. I've been carrying those boys for 12 years. Miller, Wyatt, Doherty, 25 dead in that deployment, 200 wounded, the highest casualty rate of any unit in the war. He turned his head and looked at her. The pale blue eyes were clear now. The fever's delirium retreated enough to leave him simply in pain, which was in its way a relief. I ordered them down that alley. I know, Kat said. I cleared the route. I know you did. Then how do you say his voice broke? He stopped. He started again. How do you say I sent them to the right place? How do you justify it? I see Miller's mother every time I close my eyes. I was at Arlington when they put him in the ground. I watched her fold the flag. He stopped again. The cardiac monitor registered a rhythm that was still compromised, but less erratic than it had been. How do you carry that? Kat was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer she had was classified information that she had been sitting on for 6 years, waiting for the circumstances that justified its delivery. She had not expected those circumstances to be a Tuesday afternoon in a VA hospital room in Virginia. But here they were. There is something you don't know about what happened in that alley, she said. Richard looked at her. When I crawled through the fire to get to Danny, Kat said, he wasn't just lying in the open. He was positioned against an iron gate. Behind the gate was a courtyard. She paused. Inside that courtyard was a white Toyota Hilux, packed with artillery shells and homemade explosives. The cardiac monitor's rhythm shifted, not alarmingly, but perceptibly. Richard had stopped breathing in the specific way of someone whose system had been instructed to prioritize processing over respiration. It was a VBIED, Katz said, a vehicle-borne IED. The insurgents were staging it in that alley. They were waiting for your main command element, your convoy, to clear the market square. When that truck came out, it would have taken 3 Humvees, 80 Marines minimum. It would have killed you. She watched him absorb this. Danny saw the truck, she said. He and Wyatt didn't trigger a random pressure plate. They engaged the gatekeepers. They threw a frag to disable the vehicle. The insurgents panicked and detonated a defensive charge. She paused. They didn't die because you gave a wrong order. They died because they made a decision. A split-second decision to stop a truck that would have ended 80 lives. They died saving us. The information took several seconds to find its way through 12 years of calcified guilt and settle into the space it was meant to occupy. Kat watched it happen. She had watched a lot of things happen in clinical settings that were not strictly clinical events, and she had learned to be present for them without trying to manage them. Grief was not a patient. You did not treat it. You witnessed it. Richard Sterling began to weep. Not quietly. Not with the controlled dignity of an officer managing his effect. The way a man wept when something he had been holding for 12 years finally found a way out. With his whole chest, with the specific physical violence of grief that had been kept in a military container past its capacity. The sound that came out of him was not a sound Kat had a clinical term for. She had heard it before, in other rooms, in other contexts. It was the sound of a structural element giving way. She stood up from the stool. She moved to his bedside. She put her hands carefully around his shoulders, mindful of the central line, mindful of his left forearm, mindful of all the clinical variables that existed even here, and held on. She had done this before too, in a different room, in a different desert, in a different kind of light. It was the same work. The next 2 weeks on Ward 7C were, by any clinical measure, a success. The vancomycin routed the osteomyelitis with the efficiency of an antibiotic that had finally been given unobstructed access to its target. Richard Sterling's fever broke within 48 hours. His white blood cell count began its descent toward normal range by day 4. By the end of the first week, the attending nurses were reporting something that qualified in their professional documentation as cooperation and qualified in their private language as something close to miraculous. He apologized to Brenda on Wednesday morning. He did it in the specific, formal way of a man who had been told as a boy that apologies required eye contact and precise language, and who had never unlearned it. He told her that his behavior had been unacceptable and that she was a competent nurse and that he was sorry for what he had said. Brenda, who had been bracing for the encounter since Kat told her it was coming, found that she believed him. This surprised her considerably. He was the model patient. He followed every clinical directive. He did his physical therapy exercises with the focused discipline of someone training for an operation rather than rehabilitating a femur. He was scrupulously polite to every member of the staff, and he reserved, for Kat, a quality of deference and attention that the other nurses recognized as belonging to a different category than the ordinary patient-nurse relationship. She ran a triage unit under heavy mortar fire. "Doctor," he told Harrison one morning, when the attending physician made a mild joke about Kat running his ward. There was no humor in his voice when he said it. "I'd suggest you treat her accordingly." Harrison, who had 30 years of medicine and had learned to read rooms, treated her accordingly. By discharge Friday, Richard's numbers were where they needed to be. The osteomyelitis had been arrested. The central line came out on Thursday morning without complication. His heart condition was stable, the cardiac stress of the infection having subsided as the infection itself was controlled. He was ready to leave. Kat was in the middle of her morning rounds when the charge nurse appeared at the door of room 709, where she was reviewing a medication schedule with a post-operative veteran who wanted to understand exactly what each pill was and why. "They're waiting for you," the charge nurse said. Her voice had an unusual quality. In the lobby, Kat finished the medication review. She wrote the notes. She walked to the elevator and pressed L. The lobby of Carl Vinson VA Medical Center was a large, impersonal space that had been designed for functionality rather than welcome. On a Friday morning in autumn, with the sunlight coming through the eastern windows at a low angle and gilding the floor in a way that the architect had probably not anticipated, it looked better than it usually did. Commander Richard Sterling was in a wheelchair near the center of the space. He was dressed in civilian clothes, dark blazer, pressed trousers, and on his head he wore a USMC veteran cover with the precision of someone who considered the wearing of it a matter of standard rather than sentiment. He looked, for the first time since Kat had met him, like a version of himself that the past 4 days had been concealing. Behind him, in a semicircle, were 6 men. She knew them before she had fully processed the configuration. She knew the way they stood, the particular weight distribution of men who had spent years carrying things, physical and otherwise, and had compressed their physicality into something permanent. Some of them had prosthetics that she recognized the makes and models of because she had helped fit the predecessors of several of them. Some of them had burns, scarring, and patterns she remembered the origin of. All of them had the bearing of men who had been somewhere that left a bearing. Staff Sergeant Thomas Garner was leaning on a cane because of what a rooftop had done to his right ankle in 2011. Lance Corporal David Ramirez had a scar on his left shoulder in a location that Kat knew the precise dimensions of because she had held the pressure dressing on it for 22 minutes in the back of a medevac that was not moving fast enough. These were the men of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse, the ones who had come home. Kat stopped walking. The lobby continued its ordinary Friday morning business around them. The desk staff, the waiting families, the patients in transit, and then, in the way of spaces where something of sufficient gravity occurs, it gradually stopped. Not all at once. In the spreading quiet of people who sense that something is happening that requires attention. Richard unlocked his wheelchair and moved himself forward. He stopped when he was close enough to look at her without having to raise his voice. "Doc," he said. The lobby was quiet enough that she could hear the specific weight of the word. "For 12 years, we thought we left our guardian angel in the desert." He reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and produced a small wooden box. Worn at the corners. The kind of worn that came from being handled. "We didn't know she came home." Kat's hands were not steady when she took the box. This happened sometimes. She had learned not to require steadiness of herself in all conditions. She opened it. The dog tags were silver and sandaled. The metal was the kind of dull that came from time and sun and handling rather than neglect. The names stamped into them had been stamped there with a machine in a moment before Danny Miller went to Afghanistan, when he was someone's son and someone's private first class, and the metal had no history yet. Miller, Daniel J. "His mother gave those to me 5 years ago," Richard said. His voice was the voice of a man delivering information he had been carrying for a long time. "She said to hold them until I found peace." He looked at her. "I found it, because you told me what they did in that alley, and because you were there when he went, and he didn't go alone." He paused. "Those are yours now. Document. You were the last one with him. You should carry them." The dog tags were cold in her palm. The coldness of metal that had been in a wooden box in a blazer pocket in a lobby that was cooler than it should be on a Friday in autumn. She closed her hand around them. She looked up. She found the face of every man in the semicircle. They were all weeping in the quiet way of people who had decided some time ago that there was no shame in weeping in certain circumstances and that this was one of those circumstances. Attention. Staff Sergeant Garner's voice had not lost anything. It cut through the lobby with the clarity of a command that had been given in conditions where clarity was not aesthetic but essential. The 6 men behind Richard Sterling came to attention with the specific, unified motion of people whose bodies had been trained into a response that bypassed conscious decision. Richard Sterling, who was in a wheelchair and had a bone infection in his femur that was 4 days into recovery, stood up. He stood with the posture of a flagpole, of a man whose body had been told what posture meant and had not forgotten. 6 right hands rose in a salute. And the 7th. Kat stood in the lobby of Carl Vinson Veterans Affairs Medical Center with Danny Miller's dog tags in her closed right hand and looked at 7 men saluting her. It was not the salute of protocol. It was the salute of people who had decided that what they were saluting existed beyond protocol, in the place where the real accounting was done. She raised her right hand. The dog tags were still in her fist. She returned the salute with the fierce, complete pride of a woman who had walked into a place where 19-year-old kids held the line and had held it with them, and who had then come home and spent 11 more years holding a different kind of line in a different kind of place, and who was not done yet. The bonds made in the darkest places do not dissolve. They calcify. They become structural. They hold things up that would otherwise not stand. Kat Bennett knew this. She had known it since 2010. She was still, in all the ways that mattered, knowing it now. If Kat's story reminded you that the person who is seen the most is sometimes the quietest one in the room, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories about the people walking among us, carrying more than anyone knows. And drop a comment. Have you ever met someone who turned out to be carrying something like this?